We're parents, teachers, and educators, and like you, we're passionate about restoring our culture for Christ. This is Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education. Today we have with us Hutz Hertzberg, who is the CEO of Turning Point Academy. Hutz, welcome.
Thank you, Marlon. So good to be with you. I've been looking forward to this.
It is good to have you. Tell us, I always like to start to learn a little bit about our guests. So give us a little bit of background on your education, your family, and things that have made you who you are at this moment.
Well, certainly. I am so glad to be able to share a little bit. I come from really a God-believing but non-Christian home. And so God in his grace and goodness saved me just before I went to high school and saved me in more ways than one, certainly eternally, but also probably from getting into a lot of difficulty and problems in high school. So I'm very, very thankful for that. And one by one, God began to work in our family and to bring my brother then, and then my mother, and then ultimately even my father, who had some Jewish background in his heritage, though he didn't practice the Jewish faith. So we are all testimonies of God's grace, and so thankful for that. I remember going into my counselor's office and asking where I should go to school. She was a Christian. I was a fairly new Christian, and she said, do you know that there's one of the finest Christian colleges in our backyard? And I said, no. And she said, yes, my brother teaches there part-time. It's Wheaton College, and that's where I think you should go. And so I said, okay. So I went to Wheaton College on the council of my admissions, or my counselor at high school, thinking that I was going to major in business or pre-law. But during my time there, God really redirected me to full-time ministry. And so I took my very first job out of Wheaton was working with a Fellowship of Christian Athletes, which was a great experience. There was only 2 full-time staff in Chicago at that time. I was one of them, and here's this 22-year-old young guy working with pro athletes all the way down to junior high athletes, and it was a great experience. But that really did set the trajectory of my life, Marlon. I've been really committed all my life to full-time ministry in various ways, and I would say approximately a third of my life has been in the context of the church, including serving as executive pastor at the Moody Church with Pastor Erwin Lutzer. Another third would be parachurch leadership, working with such organizations as the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, working with Christian Union, which is a leadership development organization committed to working with Ivy League students, which was a great experience. And then also in Christian education, and having privilege of serving at Wheaton College and Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, Judson University. All of those experiences and background really helped prepare me for, in a lot of ways, what I'm doing now. But one of the things I began to see is that the older I've become, the more important it's for me to really work with younger students because of the longer investment opportunity, but also because students today are being impacted in some significant ways that we never were at a much younger age. And so as much as I enjoy Christian higher education, I accepted the call to become president of Christian Heritage Academy in the north suburbs of Chicago back in 2017.
Now, the title president could be misleading, so I want to make sure we understand that, because it's not a typical title for a bricks and mortar K-12 school. Does that mean that you functioned as what we might think of as the superintendent, or was that president of the board?
Yeah, great question. No, it was superintendent, head of school, headmaster. Their title was president.
Okay.
And so that was the title that I had.
Thanks for the clarification. That's important.
Yeah, great question. Great question. And so that was a wonderful experience. That was a school started by Dr. Wayne Grudem and a few other families. Some of you will know Dr. Wayne Grudem,
Sure.
Well-known systematic theologian. He was a professor at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. His kids were coming up to school age. There was no Christian schools in the northern suburbs of Chicago. And so he and a few other families started Christian Heritage Academy. And so that's where I was serving until just very recently in the last 3 years, and stepped into this role that I'm in currently.
Well, tell us about that. What was the impetus for that change?
Well, when I started at the Christian Heritage Academy, it was like I said, a great experience, though I had been working with college students and college colleagues, professors. I thoroughly enjoyed working with younger students and working with colleagues that were teaching younger students. And one of those staff members was a young man who worked in our lunchroom, and he started telling me about this young man named Charlie Kirk, and asked if I'd ever heard of him. And I said, no, but based on what you're saying, he sounds like he's a wonderful young guy. I'd love to meet him. And so I received a text from Charlie Kirk out of the blue a couple days later. And he said, if there's anything I can do to help you, congratulations on your new position.
Oh, wow.
Would love to be supportive. And so that really started our connection. And Charlie became a supporter, a generous supporter of Christian Heritage Academy. And so that started our connection. But here's the best part of the story. This friend who now, this friend of Charlie, who was a part-time staff member at our school, shared with me, and then I found out exactly what happened from his teacher, that he was a student at our school, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. And I had wonderful teachers each of those years, but in 5th grade year, he had a particularly wonderful, godly teacher. And this is where so many of our listeners today, Marlon, will really appreciate this. Every day she prayed over the chairs of her students and just committing them to the Lord and praying that they would come to faith or grow in their faith. And Charlie was one of those students. And during the course of that 5th grade year for Charlie, he commits his life to Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior, which really set the trajectory of Charlie's life in so many ways. And some that are listening today will know who he is, and others probably not so much. But Charlie now impacts millions on a daily basis, all kinds of ways through media. But what's so encouraging about that story is that for whatever reason, his folks took him out of our school after the 5th grade year, not because of what had happened, just for logistical reasons and other reasons, but Lord had him there long enough to actually come to faith in Christ. And again, Charlie is a man of faith, loves the Lord. And that really was, a meaningful connection to our school, and he's forever grateful for our school. But that's also how we got connected. And so when he decided that we needed to start this new division, which now I currently lead, he reached out to me.
That's wonderful. So that's how you went from Christian Heritage Academy to Turning Point Academy, and that's wonderful. Tell me, as you address your position as the CEO of Turning Point Academy, what are the problems that you're observing and seeking to resolve? In other words, in some respects, why does it exist?
Well, that's such an important question, Marlon. And let me answer it in a couple of ways. For years, this organization, Turning Point USA, is about 11 years old. It started with Charlie right out of high school, feeling like there needs to be some conservative voice in college and universities across the country. And so early on, that was really what Turning Point and Charlie Kirk was all about. Today, it's about a lot more than that. But even today, he still goes to college campuses, universities across the country, engages the students. He's visiting 22 campuses just this fall, getting a great response. Also, he gets
let me just say parenthetically, if I may interrupt you for just a moment, I really enjoy the videos that are on the social media platforms of him engaged with students, seeking to entrap him, to convince them of something else, and his mastery of information and ability to articulate it is really remarkable, and it's a joy to see such an apologist at work.
Yeah, absolutely. Charlie does that about as well as you can do it, in a winsome way, in a non-contentious way, but holding forth truth. And so I totally agree with you. Dr. Robert George, professor of jurisprudence at Princeton University, also had the similar observation. And I just heard Dr. George, who's a professional acquaintance, share this recently when he was being interviewed. They said, Dr. George, what is different with college students during the course of your 39 years teaching at Princeton? And Dr. George made this really interesting comment, and really along the lines of what Charlie has been observing as well. He said, I noticed and have noticed that in the last 10 years, students now are coming to Princeton already indoctrinated, whereas the first 20 years of my teaching or so, they were coming and they were much more able to be influenced, and they were coming with not quite as much background and baggage as they come now. And he said, that is a tremendous challenge. And he said, it's happening at the high school level. It's happening now at the middle school level. We would argue that it's happening even at the grade school level. So Charlie saw this and felt compelled that we need to get to kids earlier. Waiting until they're in college or even high school is too late. And so about 3 years ago, he started this new division called Turning Point Academy, which is really the K through 12 education division of Turning Point USA. And that's when he reached out to me and asked if I'd be willing to lead this new division.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. And I couldn't agree more. I'm going to come back to that whole question of timing and what's happened in recent years and that sort of thing. But I want to ask a little bit of a self-serving question. How does Veritas fit into your plans and what you all are doing?
Oh, we love Veritas. And I'm saying that not just because I'm in this role, but because as an educator myself, as one who had led a school prior to stepping into this role, and then also because our model school that we're now replicating across the country uses Veritas curriculum and resources in a very significant way. And so we are so grateful for Veritas, for the influence, for the partnership, for Dr. Perrin, for many, many different ways that you're influencing Christian and especially Christian classical education across the country. So we're supporters. At our most recent Educator Summit, Dr. Perrin was one of our plenary speakers. Veritas was represented, of course. And so we are not trying to take in any way, shape, or form, or to compete, I should say, with Veritas. We want to get the resources and the materials out there that Veritas is producing.
Well, we appreciate that and look forward to being able to help any way that we can. Thank you. It's not typical for me to plug Veritas in the podcast here, but given the opportunity, I wasn't going to miss it. So thanks for what you said. Let's go back to what I said we'd come back to. Many think that what we need is a returning to the 1950s. Reading, writing, and arithmetic being basic to education maybe would be a descriptive mindset for it. But Dorothy Sayers, who can be credited with giving the vision to the author, Doug Wilson, of the book, Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. Sayers' essay was an essay that was originally a speech at Oxford, of course, called The Lost Tools of Learning. So the book, Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, borrows from it heavily, has it in the book. But Sayers says in around 1947, 1948, that we've got some really significant problems in education. It would probably never be of the quality that it once was. And it was Wilson that said, well, I want to do that, and then documented it in the book. And that became, I think, the renaissance, the resurgence of a new popularity that is continuing to increase in its continuing to grow. Your 2PA is embracing a form of a classical education model. We are all about classical Christian education. But she's identifying problems in the 50s where many people think the problems that we have today, and I know that you didn't even imply that indoctrination happening in high school was a new thing. So I'm not suggesting that this is a problem that you have, but I think it's good for our audience to understand where these problems came from that we're dealing with.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I would say in response that if she's referring to the 1850s, that's probably more accurate in the sense that really going back to the 1800s, late 1800s, even the early 1900s, the church had a much more predominant role in the education of our children. In fact, they looked upon that as really their responsibility to educate children. And so they looked at education as a part of the mission and the ministry, if you will, looked at it really as being missional, if you will, in terms of the holistic education and not just the Sunday school kind of thing that became prevalent in the 1900s. And so we meaning the church, have primarily lost that vision for education as a role in a ministry or an academic ministry of the local church. And I think there's various reasons for that, Marlon, as you would understand. But one is with the introduction of, really, I'd say around the 1920s, with people like Dewey and Locke and others who introduced this progressive kind of social liberalism kind of philosophy of education that began to permeate education. So way before the 1950s. And now, you know, through this last century, we've seen the fruit of that in our educational system. But with the birth of the government system or the public school system, churches began to then abdicate their role as really being the primary source of education for the community, for the families in their church. And so I think it goes back farther than the 1950s as the root of the problem. Yeah. And so thankfully, there is a resurgence in the recapturing of really classical education, which was, as you know, the form of education. It wasn't, well, classical and traditional Christian education or classical, and it was classical education was the way that children were taught and learned. And so again,
really, Latin as a standard course was commonplace prior to our educations. It didn't have the same role that it did hundreds of years ago and wasn't used the same way, which I think is problematic also, and that's a different topic for a different day. But we were just beyond Latin being a staple in our the education of in the K-12 education.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And what I was going to say is what has been so encouraging to me and to us at Turning Point Academy is that not only the continuing growth and resurgence of what we would call classical Christian education, but also that more and more pastors and churches are beginning to see and to reclaim their role of education as a part of the ministry of the church, as an academic ministry, if you will. And so that's why we're partnering with churches across the country to help them to really reclaim that role, because we see it as a biblical role for the church, certainly a biblical role for parents to have that primary responsibility of the education of their children. But we see it as in partnership with the local church as much as that is possible. And so that's been encouraging. Now, on the downside, there's still a lot of churches, a lot of pastors that, for whatever reason, don't want to go into that arena, and we're trying to help encourage them to say, we will help you. And just to give one example that we're so encouraged about, we're actually working now with a cohort of 26 different groups. Most of those groups are attached to a local church that they are moving through a process that we take them a 9-month process that they will launch as a fully autonomous school within their church, in most cases, 9 months from now, during next fall. And so we're encouraged by that, but there's so many more that need to be impacted and really influenced and really catch the vision for why this is so critical today.
Yeah, very good. Tell me, and you don't need to be short on this, we've got enough time. But what does success look like for Turning Point Academy in the context of the influence points? I think that's primarily America, and so keeping it focused there.
Yes, well, I will try to keep it short because it could be a very long answer, but
yeah, that wasn't an invitation to 20 minutes. That was an invitation to 8 or 10.
Marlon, as you well know, the question behind that question, I mean, there's so many challenges. I mean, you think of the role that the teacher unions have today, and their outsized influence of, really dominating so much of what happens in education in the public arena. Most of it would be for bad, we would argue. I could give you examples in our own state of Illinois here. But I think in terms of, what is success for us at Turning Point Academy, we are trying to encourage to wake up, even to influence as many pastors and churches as we possibly can, along the lines of what I was just sharing, that the role of education is not something to be offloaded to government or to the public sector. It's really a role for the church, working in partnership with the local, with parents in their local assembly, with their local church. And so we want pastors to understand that. And so we're trying to equip them. We're trying to inform them. I speak at a lot of different pastors' conferences and summits, trying to help them understand what the need is, what the opportunity is, and how we can help them. And the great thing about what we're trying to do is that we're not really asking for anything. We're just trying to help. And at the end of the day, when the school is launched, it's not called Turning Point Academy. It's called Vintage Christian Academy, or whatever the name of the church is. And we don't even charge for our time or services. We're just very, very jealous that we can help get these schools in the context of local churches off the ground, using our background, our expertise, our resources to be able to help them, mentor them, and really put them on a very positive trajectory. And the great news is that it's happening. And so, again, what is success? Well, in our first couple of years, we have about 12 different schools now that been birthed out of the context of local churches with pastors that maybe didn't know what they were going to do, how they were going to do it, but looked to us. We were able to help them, and now they're actually having school take place in their as a part of their ministry. And we see it as biblical. We see it as missional. We see it as eternal. We don't see it as just this peripheral thing on the side. We see it as central to the mission of local churches and pastors. Now, not everybody feels that way, and we respect those that disagree, but more and more pastors are seeing it because they realize there is such great need in their community, within their church, with their families, because the things that kids are being taught today are in direct opposition to what they're trying to teach the kids and in those families in the 1 or 2 hours a week they have them. Kids are at school 35 hours a week, 10,600 hours of education. And, it's unrealistic to think that in 1 or 2 hours of a week that a church, any church or any youth pastor can undo the education that is, and really more the indoctrination that kids are receiving today. So I think pastors are beginning to see that. We're trying to help them see that, and then we're trying to help them take the next step. And for some of them, and I'll finish with this, Marlon, for some of them, whatever reason they feel like, well, we can't really do a school, that's fine. Maybe you would consider a literacy center where the lift is a little bit different and really look at that as an opportunity. Maybe you can't do that, but you could potentially have scholarships for your families that want to send their kids to Christian education or some kind of homeschooling hybrid kind of option. There's certainly an opportunity for that. There's also an opportunity just to educate your families in terms of helping them understand what's going on in education today. It's so different than when we went to school. I don't know if education was ever neutral. I would argue it was never neutral in the first place.
Right.
But it's definitely not neutral now, as you know, and our listeners know. There's an agenda. It's indoctrination. I would argue that it's evil. If Charlie was on the call with us, he would use the word it's demonic. And I really, truly agree with him. Again, not everybody would agree, but it's really unfortunate. And so we've got to give parents alternative options. And that's what we're trying to do. And again, back to your original question, that's how we measure success. How well are we doing that across the country?
Yeah. There are lots of wonderful initiatives, yours being a wonderful example of that, of ways that we're recognizing and then providing the means for an education that takes the gospel at its core seriously. I still remember in 1962, I believe it was, when we were no longer praying or reading the Bible in public schools. And we might argue that that's what we need to get back to. I would argue that's not what we need to get back to, that the problems that you identified as early 20th century and late 19th century might even have a connection to Horace Mann and what he intended to begin with. Dewey, of course, brought implementation to some of that ideology. And ideology in and of itself doesn't do anything until it's put into practice. And so, how we discern that, I know you wouldn't disagree with that. I see you nodding with me as we talk. But we're dealing with something that at its core, the educational system that is so much a part of American culture, it's hard to believe that maybe it was a problem from its onset. And now we have people saying that. You all are saying that in wonderful ways, and we're happy to be partners with you in doing that, because we want parents and churches, the institutions ordained by God to handle education of young children, to be where it comes from, because it has to. We can't send our kids to be educated by the Egyptians and wonder why they didn't turn out like Israelites, or we can't send them to the pagans for their godless education and have them and wonder why they don't turn out like Christians.
Yeah, that's so well said, and we totally agree with you. And so that's one of the reasons we exist, and one of the reasons that we're ramping up. The need is great, the opportunity is great, and so we're committed as much as we possibly can. And so we've talked about starting schools. We also do educator summits, which we referenced. We do create some pieces of curriculum where we feel like there's a need or an opportunity. And you'd be encouraged by this, Marlon. We have a Turning Point Academy Association, which is now comprised of affiliates from 42 states. We'll, I think shortly have all 50 states, but these are people who affirm basic values that we feel are absolutely essential to really God-centered education, and want to be connected to something, to an organization and to others that share those values and that are purposely, intentionally trying to implement them in education, Christian education across the country. And so we're really excited about our Turning Point Association that is growing. And so those are some of the other ways that we're trying to make a difference in the world of education. But you're right, there are some excellent things that are happening. I had the privilege of meeting some wonderful people doing some amazing things. And so it is super encouraging. I don't know that 10, 15, certainly 20 years ago, there would be all these different initiatives that are taking place, but now there is. But with all that being said, I still feel like we're just kind of scratching the surface with really what needs to be done.
Absolutely. Well, Hutz, thank you for joining us. Really good to have you here and good to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
And folks, thank you for joining us on this episode of Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education.